have Cantor Nemi again with us.
Yay!
And reprising, since I believe we're going to be coming to the end of Psalm 10, our Psalm 10 study today. I thought that I would wrap up with, as I think it was requested actually, a reprise of this somewhere between half and three-quarter baked composition setting verses from Psalms 3, 9, and 10. So this is Kuma Adonai. Great. All right. Oop. Kuma Adonai al Yaoz Enosh Yishaftu Goyim al Panecha. Kuma Adonai en Nisa Yadecha al Tishkach Anavim. Kuma, Kuma, Kuma Adonai Hoshieni Elohai Hoshieni Hoshieni Elohai Elohai Kuma Adonai. Rise, Adonai, let not mortals be strong, let the nations be judged before you. Rise, Adonai, and lift up your hands, and don't forget the lowly. Rise, 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 Adonai, save me, my God. Won't you save me? Won't you save me, Elohai? Elohai, Kuma Adonai. Kuma Adonai. Kuma Adonai.
Beautiful.
Jacob, it's so difficult for me to wrap my head around the fact that in your mind that's somewhere between half and three quarters baked. It is really gorgeous, and I'm so appreciative that you're willing to share your artistic process with us and share your artistic products with us. That is a great choice for our class today. Since we'll be looking at Psalm 9, we'll be looking at Psalm 10, and this will be a chapter mark in this group's formal study. So to begin today, I'm going to hand it over to Harold for two reasons. Number one, I'd love Harold to give just a little outline of what's to come in the next 2 weeks, since this is closing our week's study session, and it is closing my opportunity to study with this group. You're moving into a new phase of study for the next 2 weeks. So I'm going to ask Harold to just sort of like remind us, lay it out so everybody knows what's coming. And then to begin our formal study today, Harold has some fascinating information about Psalms 9 and 10 that I'm really eager for him to share.
Thank you, Rabbi. And Rabbi, we cannot thank you enough for your own particular grace and style that you brought to this class for the last 2 weeks, and encouraging our new Hebrew learners to take a spin around the block and perhaps read Hebrew in front of a group for the first time. I could see the smiles on people's faces. And for all that you do in helping to guide the educational offerings at CBST. I think we are all unbelievably proud that a synagogue like ours can offer 3 levels of Hebrew for free during the summer. The Psalms class, Rabbi Atara Cohen's classes, Rabbi Moskowitz's classes. I will personally say that these classes have been a lifesaver for a number of us during this time of shutdown. And we cannot thank you enough, but we will try on screen by giving you a nice Zoom thank you. So next week and the week after, we will be keeping to the schedule we have now, which is Monday through Thursday from 10 to 10:45. What we will be doing is completely different than what we've been doing for the past 20 weeks, which is to just read through the Psalms, Hebrew and then English, one after another, with a pause between them, as they are used, as is a style of studying Psalms. Um, you can come and go as you'd like. We will be here at 9:45 to say hello. We are likely not going, we're going to likely going to be giving our hardworking musicians the 2 weeks off for their own vacation. So we will just be starting at 9:40, at 10 and going to 10:45. I don't know how far we're going, but I do think that we're going to get more than 10 Psalms done if all we're doing is reading them in the 2 weeks. So if you would like to come, you are welcome. You can come as many or as few days as you'd like. I think at this point, all of us have a book of Psalms at home. Start reading on Psalm 11, and if one of the Psalms really speaks to you, you may want to volunteer to be the English reader for that Psalm. Or if you feel your Hebrew is up to it or you want to practice, you may want to be the Hebrew reader for one of those Psalms. I'll be sending out an email and we'll have a little informal registration sheet. But that is basically it. We will not be stopping to discuss them. We will certainly be encouraging people to discuss them in the Facebook group. We will not be reading offerings, but if something hits you and you'd like to do an offering on that, we would be glad to accept it. So that is what we will be doing for the next 2 weeks. And now, let me turn.
What's going to happen in 2 weeks and 1 day?
Rabbi Kleinbaum, I believe, will be back. And will we be studying Psalm 27 as that begins our sort of preparation for the month of Elul? Is that correct?
Exactly.
Oh, got that right. So Rabbi Rapport posed a fascinating question at the beginning of these 2 weeks. Are Psalms 9 and 10 two separate texts, or are they one text which has somehow been separated during the long process of textual transmission? We've looked at it a couple of different ways. We've looked at it through the issue of the acrostic, which gives us one hint. I know that we've looked at it, some of us have, through the content of the psalm. Does it seem like it's one continuous text or not? I did send out that the two texts combined yesterday with my attempt at highlighting the letters that seem to form the acrostic. And I thank you. I will say that it was sort of a rhetorical question that I said, are these one or two? But many of you wrote back to me with some particularly thoughtful things, among them Jeremy Lawrence, who I hope we can call on when we get to that point. Now we're going to look at two other pieces of evidence that may help us to solve this case. Let me share my screen. If you recall, several weeks ago, hold on a second, I'll view full screen, let's see, enter full screen. We discussed the Septuagint, which is the oldest surviving, the Septuagint, the oldest surviving complete text of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew that we have, date from approximately 1000 CE, the Leningrad and Aleppo codices. But a Greek translation, the Septuagint, was produced in approximately 300 BCE for the Greek-speaking Jewish community of Alexandria in Egypt. So the translators of the Septuagint were looking at a Hebrew text 1,300 years older than the oldest one available to us right now. In general, it seems as if the text they were looking at was very close to the text we have. The text of Psalms in the Septuagint seems to reflect a text very similar to the one we have, although their understanding of the superscriptions in Sela are somewhat different than ours, which is another lecture altogether. There are 4 places, and only 4 places, in which the division of verses in the Septuagint are different than the official, or what we call the Masoretic Hebrew text. In 2 cases, Psalms which are separate in the Hebrew Bible are combined. 9 and 10 are Psalms under question, are combined into 9, and 14 and 15 are combined in the Septuagint. 2 Psalms which are 1 in the Hebrew Bible are divided into in the Septuagint, 116 and 147. The text of the individual verses are the same. Only the assignment into separate Psalms is different. Given that the Psalms are divided or combined only 4 times, and the total text is almost exactly the same between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible we have, it seems that the Greek translators were following the Hebrew Bible they had very closely, and their combination of Psalms 9 and 10 should be considered carefully whether or not you're looking at the acrostic. Although Alter and others question whether the Hebrew text we have can be trusted, all those notes that say these words don't seem to make sense, maybe it should be read differently, it seems as if the Septuagint translators were looking at the same text we have and made no amendments to try to make it more intelligible. Another note, the Septuagint was likely the Bible familiar to the Jewish population of the land of Israel at the time of Jesus, and the Bible, the gospel writers refer to when they report Jesus's quotations from the Hebrew scriptures. The Christian New Testament, written starting in about 70, uses a form of Greek very similar to the Septuagint, and the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament are still used in the Eastern churches, such as Darina's Bulgarian church and the Greek church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. So if we were to judge here, we'd say the Septuagint tells us that 9 and 10 were originally one text, and I'm going to show you a picture here of the Septuagint with that text of what is number 9. Hold on, let me reshare with the Septuagint. I didn't want to press my book too closely. It is a beautiful, thick, beautifully printed text. So it's a little hard to see in the gutter, but you can see 9, which stops with the word Sela at the end of verse 21, which is translated in the Greek as diapsalma, continues with a verse 22, 23, 24, 25, all the way through a verse 39. So in the Septuagint, Psalm 9 is 139 verse psalm. And then we pick up at 10, after which the numbering between the two texts becomes not the same and a little confusing. But here you see it, Psalm 9 in the Vulgate, 1 Psalm, 39 verses.
In the Septuagint, one Psalm, 39
one
verses.
Psalm, 39 verses.
And exactly as Harold said, the crux of how Psalm numbering gets confusing when you're moving between different faith traditions that use different source texts, even if we're looking at the same basic Hebrew Bible scripture.
So there are little tables which tell you a psalm in this tradition is the psalm in this tradition. Now we go to the Vulgate, which just means Vulgate is the language spoken by the common people. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, there was a need for a Latin translation of both the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament, because Latin was the language spoken throughout the Roman Empire. There were piecemeal translations done in various communities called Vetus Latina, which is Old Latin for Old Latin, but there was no official Latin version. It's likely that these early Latin translations were done from the Greek Septuagint, not the Hebrew original. But then we get St. Jerome, who lived from 347 to 420 CE, who was commissioned by Pope Damasus. He created a new Latin translation of the Christian New Testament from the Greek, of course, the original Greek, and of the Psalter, the book of Psalms, and his first translation was from the Greek. It seems as if the Vetus Latina, or the Old Latin translators, had already translated it from the Greek, and that was the text that was being used in worship, which we'll come back to in a minute. However, Jerome then went back and translated the entire Hebrew Bible directly from the Hebrew, not from the Septuagint Greek, and did a second translation of the Psalms, this time directly from the Hebrew. In editions of the Vulgate, both of his Hebrew Latin translations of Psalms are included side by side. One is called Juxta Septuaginta Emendatus, and the other Juxta Hebraicum Translatus. The first is following the Septuagint, and the second one means translated following the Hebrew. In both, the texts of our Psalms 9 and 10 are combined, although after verse 21, the end of our Psalm 9, the verses in most editions are double numbered, so you could compare back and forth. It may be that the Hebrew Bible Jerome was looking at had the text of our 9 and 10 together, It may be that after producing one translation from the Septuagint with the text together, even if he saw the verses divided into two Psalms in the Hebrew Bible before him, he didn't want to deal with two separate numbering systems. And so in the Vulgate, both from the Septuagint and from the Hebrew, our texts of 9 and 10 are completed. And just because it has to be said, Jerome's Vulgate is the text printed in the Gutenberg Bible, the very first printed book around 1453. For Psalms, Gutenberg, interestingly, used the translations from the Septuagint. As I said, it was likely the one that had entered into use for worship early on. And I have some pictures to show you. Let me open them. Let's see.
While we are
Here we go.
juggling between images, how incredible is it that we have a classicist among us, at least one. This is a fabulous, fabulous perspective to be taking on the text. I'm really excited about this.
So here we go. Who has ever seen a copy of the Vulgate laid out like this? This is the beginning of the book of Psalms. This is from the Septuagint, and this is from the Hebrew. Each of them has the text. It's the same Psalm in Hebrew. It's the same Psalm translated differently. And the translations really are quite different. And then here is the text of Psalm 9. Excuse me, the text of Psalm 9. And I think I can do it so that you see after verse 21, you see here, we have it's verse 22, but then it's also verse 1 if you were going to be comparing it with the Hebrew. So it's 22 is 1, and Semper here is their translation of Selah, which again, I will come back to in another lecture. So if we can go to, I don't have it. So that is how it's shown in the Vulgate. And I just need to show you this, which is the Gutenberg Bible. Happen to have one right here that I put on my scanner this morning. And this is actually the beginning of Psalm 9 in Latin. Confitebor tibi Domine in toto corde mea. In red here, this is how they show the superscription. So the Gutenberg calls out the superscription differently from the text. And then you can see the colored parts here are done by hand, that the text here in the movable script is black. And then once you bought your copy in vellum or paper, you would have sent it to the scriptorium and had them make it pretty for you. You can go to the Morgan Library in New York, and if you go inside Mr. Morgan's library, you will see a copy of the Gutenberg Bible that you are welcome to take a look at. I have one more picture to show, I hope. Oh, I don't know where that went. Now to go on with a little bit more to consider. Let's see. Do we all see my text again?
Yes, we do.
Okay. In the English translations back to the King James Bible, they use the Hebrew or Masoretic numbering in divisions. One of the keys is look at Psalm 23. If Psalm 23 is the Lord is my shepherd, you have the Masoretic numbering. If Psalm 23 is not the Lord is my shepherd, you have the Vulgate or Septuagint numbering. One more thought to consider, when we're talking about a text, whether it's 1 or 2. At CBST, we have a text that was written as 1, but is almost always recited as if it were 2, the prayer for our country. When included in our service bulletin, it's laid out as one text with a line separating the two portions, but at the Bema, we have 2 separate laminated cards, each with half. It's quite possible that ancient methods of producing text were different than ours. They were created as spoken word text and then transcribed. We shouldn't think of David sitting in his chambers with chewing on his reed pen, scratching away at his parchment, writing out the Psalms, but perhaps consider the book of Psalms a transcription of texts that have been passed down orally. I ask you, if someone attended one of our services and transcribed what they heard, Would they know that the prayer for our country is one text divided in two? Or would they transcribe each half separately from various services, thinking that there were actually two versions of the prayer for our country? And might a class 1,000 years later be looking at those two texts, wondering whether they might actually make one?
Thank you, Harold. I love where you ended. I love the idea of putting ourselves in the creator's seat instead of the student seat, and thinking about the legacy that we're leaving for those who will discover us all these years later. That's perfect.
So now I turn it back to you, Rabbi.
Sure. And you should really, because you're handing it back to me, scroll through the chat and see how much appreciation
I will. Thank you very
there. So let's pause for just a second. This was a lot of fantastic information. I want to take any questions or comments, but let's limit it to just Septuagint, Vulgate, translation. We're going to hold off on the essential question of one psalm, two psalms, does it even matter? Because in just a second, I want to put up Harold's highlighted perhaps version of the acrostic, which, you know, he followed Alter very closely. And that can be a nice source text for us to look at one more time before we engage in some debate. So before we go there, any questions about Vulgate, any questions about Septuagint or these translations for Harold? Mostly not for me.
Shep has had his hand up for a while, if it is indeed a question about my presentation. Shep?
Oh, yeah. I'm just curious, when they combine them into one, or later on you said some of the songs were divided, does that change the numbering of the songs? Get it all confused?
Yes. The numbering of the Psalms in the Septuagint and Vulgate is different than the numbering of the Psalms that we use. And there are tables. I can share something on Facebook later that a guide to how to compare the two. But they are after Psalm 9, they are numbered differently. Lisa Brown.
Hi, Harold. Thank you. That was wonderful. So going forward a little bit, I did a paper years ago on the scripture and translation, which was the Buber Rosenzweig attempt to translate the Hebrew Bible into German. And one of the things he says is that the Luther Bible is essentially Christian. And I was just wondering, just taking from
Lisa, I'm gonna go.
Listen to the end of my, so I'm just wondering, how would that happen in a translation, and if the Vulgate does that?
What is the question exactly?
How do you make the translation Christian, essentially Christian, instead of essentially Jewish? And do you think that the Vulgate does that?
It's more of a question that I can answer right now, but I will be happy to call you and talk about it at great length. I will give you just one example, that Christus in the Greek just means anointed with oil. And it does not have a capital letter because Greek does not have any capital letters. When you're doing a translation, you can translate Christus as anointed, which would be the Hebrew translation, or you can translate it as Christ, which would be a Christian translation. And there are many, many examples of that, whether ecclesia is gathering or church, for instance. But let's put that with a pin. It's a fantastic question, and we just don't have enough time to go into it today.
Thank you.
So I'm going to turn to a question that Lori put into the chat, which is something that I have something to say about, having zero insight into the Septuagint, which I pronounce Septuagint instead of Septuagint, which probably proves why Harold should be teaching this part of the class instead of me. But Lori wants to know, what was the classical rabbinic understanding as the source for Hebrew Bible? And, you know, Harold, also chime in whenever you want, but there's sort of a traditional understanding, and it figures into the Torah service. So when we're literally lifting up the Torah and showing it to the kahal, to the community, so that everybody can attest, like, yep, we read from that exact section, even if you weren't standing there doing an aliyah or standing there reading the Torah, doing the blessing or reading the Torah, we say a certain verse. Who remembers what we say?
Ki mitzion tetzei Torah.
Well, that's when we take the Torah out, and that's also a great illustrative verse.
Oh, Yad
Or
Moshe.
from Zion comes Torah. But let's see if
Adonai
anybody
and Yad
heard
Moshe.
another one.
Torah.
Well, I think I heard Ira.
Zot HaTorah Asher.
The Zot HaTorah. Excellent. Good memory. So we point. You're not, some people say don't point with your index finger. Wrap your seat around your pinky finger because it's rude to point at people and the Torah. We say the Zot HaTorah. This is the Torah. Asher Sam Moshe, that was given, lifted up to Moses. Al Pi Adonai, from the mouth of God, Biyad Moshe, by Moses's hand. And that's probably the most concise definition of where does Torah come from in classical rabbinic Judaism. Torah is God's word written down by Moses. And there is a perfect transmissive link there. And then when the rabbis talk about Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, that's the part of the Torah that God spoke and Moses actually wrote down. And then there's Torah Ba'al Peh. This is the oral Torah that God spoke, but Moses didn't necessarily write it down in the same compilation. The oral Torah is where we get our Gemara from, our Talmud, our Mishnah. So it's all part of a larger body of Torah, but some of it got written down and some of it just got said over time, alluding to Harold's mention that much of this is an oral transmission, both oral that it's spoken and oral that it's heard, and that's how we remember it. We repeat it over and over again. So a traditional understanding would say the Psalms came from God. They're all part of God's divine imagination. And Moses didn't necessarily write that part down, which is why we're pretty comfortable saying David was the author of the Psalms. But it's all part of, the divine imagination that's out in the ether for those with close relationships to God to transmit to us. What we see much later, in a similar age to what Lisa was referring to when Buber and Rosenzweig were working on making a German translation of the Bible, in the age of Haskalah, the enlightenment of Jewish literature, you see more involvement in university structures in Europe. And in particular, there emerges a method called source criticism, which means that you read literature not just as story, but also as a product of the author's time and place and context. And what some people considered to be completely heretical and what some people considered to be completely necessary, we started looking at sacred text in a source critical method. We started asking questions in this Enlightenment period in Germany about, so what if the Bible is a piece of written work and we should be considering its author's time, its place, its context, instead of word of God that cannot be questioned at all or considered to be part of human creation. This is where the documentary hypothesis that Robert Alter ascribes to comes from, the idea that, well, if we're being critical, if we're looking with a magnifying glass at the text itself and we're seeing all of these inconsistencies, one theoretically pretty simple answer would be maybe there are a bunch of different documents that have all been put together, maybe by different people, maybe in completely different times, maybe in completely different parts of the world, that are sewn together in a beautiful patchwork quilt that make up the Hebrew Bible as a whole. Does this make it less holy because it might not be Al Pi Adonai B'Yad Moshe, one perfect moment of divine transmission, but rather a creation of humanity? Does it make it more holy because it's a testament to humanity's ability to create? Another great question for debate. That was a pretty long answer to a pretty short question. So where I would like to bounce now, unless we've got more questions about the other translations of the Psalms, is look back at our Psalm, look at it as 9 and 10, sort of blow through the English translation pretty quickly, give everybody a chance to see the possible acrostic structure, and then start talking. Is this one Psalm? Is this two?
Would you like me to put that up, Rabbi?
I would love you to put up your highlighted version.
Here you go.
Marvelous. So keep in mind, the two tools that we sort of have at our disposal. We've been talking about the history a lot, but if we're looking at two literary devices which might indicate to us for or against two psalms, one psalm, we're looking at acrostic, specifically in the Hebrew, but Levy does a great translation that incorporates the acrostic in English, a little interpretively, but I think very, very faithfully. And Alter, if you're looking at his translation, puts the Hebrew letter from the acrostic in the margin so you can follow along with the English. So if you want to be looking at either of those to assist your argument, please go ahead. But the other thing that we're looking at is the content. Does it sound like a continuous story? Does it sound like two very separate ideas? I would love, I see Ben Shafran raising his hand. It might be a question, it might be a comment, but actually, Benjamin, if I could ask you to be our Hebrew reader and we could go back and forth through the entirety very quickly, that would just like delight me to no end. Would you be willing?
Sure. You want me to read both Psalms in Hebrew?
Yes, so you're going to read the Hebrew line and I'm going to echo you with the English line, starting with verse 1 of Psalm 9, or verse 1 of Psalm 9/10. Please.
למנצח אלמוד לבן מזמור לדוד.
For the leader, Almut Laben, to be determined, a Psalm of David.
אודה אדוני בכל ליבי, אספר כל נפלאותיך.
I will praise you, Adonai, with all my heart. I will tell all your wonders.
אשמחה ואלצה בך, אזמרה שמך העליון.
I will rejoice and exult in you, singing a hymn to your name, O Most High.
ושוב אויבי אחור, ייכשלו ויאבדו מפניך.
When my enemies retreat, they stumble to their doom at your presence.
כי עשית משפטי ודיני, ישבת לכיסא שופט צדק.
For you uphold my right and claim, enthroned as righteous judge.
גארת גויים, איבדת רשע, שמם מחית לעולם ועד.
You blast the nations, you destroy the wicked, you blot out their name forever.
האויב, תמו חרבות לנצח וערים נטשת, אבד זכרם המה.
The enemy is no more, ruins everlasting. You have torn down their cities, their very names are lost.
ואדוני לעולם ישב, כונן למשפטו כיסאו.
But Adonai abides forever. God has set up God's throne for judgment.
והוא ישפוט תבל בצדק, ידין לאומים במישרים.
It is God who judges the world with righteousness, rules the peoples with equity.
ויהי אדוני משגב לדך, משגב לעיתות בצרה.
Adonai is a haven for the oppressed, a haven in times of trouble.
ויפתחו בך יודעי שמך, כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני.
For those who know your name trust you. You do not abandon those who turn to you, O Adonai.
זמרו לאדוני יושב ציון, הגידו בעמים עלילותיו.
Sing a hymn to Adonai who reigns in Zion. Declare God's deeds among the people.
כי דורש דמים אותם זכר, לא שכח צעקת עניים.
For God does not ignore the cry of the afflicted. God who requites bloodshed is mindful of them.
חנני אדוני, ראה עוניים בשונאי, מרוממי משערי מוות.
Have mercy on me, O Adonai. See my affliction at the hands of my foes, you who lift me from the gates of death.
למען אספר כל תהילותיך בשערי בת ציון, אגילה בישועתך.
So in the gates of fair Zion, I might tell all your praise. I might exult in your deliverance.
טבעו גויים בשחת עשו, ברשת זו טמנו נלכדה רגדם.
The nations sink in the pit they have made. Their own foot is caught in the net they have hidden.
נודע אדוני משפט, עשה בפועל כפיו נוקש רשע, היגיון סלע.
Adonai has made God's self known. God works judgment. The wicked person is snared by their own devices. Higayon, Selah.
ישובו רשעים לשאולה, כל גויים שכחי אלוהים.
Let the wicked be in Sheol, all the nations who ignore God.
כי לא לנצח ישכח אביון, תקוות עניים תאבד לאל.
Not always shall the needy be ignored, nor the hope of the afflicted forever lost.
קומה אדוני על יעוז אנוש, ישפטו גויים על פניך.
Rise, O Adonai, let not humanity have power, let the nations be judged in your presence.
שיטה אדוני מורה להם ידעו גויים, אנוש הם הסלע.
Strike fear into them, O Adonai, let the nations know they are only mortals. Selah.
You want me to continue 10?
I think we can end there because I want to make sure people have time to talk. Thank you for asking me because I think you also noticed it was 10:35. Harold, let's bring the translation down, but everybody's got it in their inbox if you want to look at it again. So the two literary devices we were thinking of, one was acrostic and one was content. Is there a continuous voice, you know, through narration or through message and story that's being told over the course of these two Psalms? Or do they really seem like two distinct and separate entities? Who's got thoughts about this? I know Jeremy wrote something.
Yes, Jeremy.
And Benjamin, I sort of co-opted his hand raise to make him a reader, but might have something to share on this subject.
So I wouldn't, I don't know much about the acrostic or the various translations that Harold so beautifully laid out. But in terms of content, there is a distinct difference between 9 and 10. 9 being a thanksgiving psalm of things that God has already done, and it's a very positive images all throughout. 10 begins with God being absent and a lamentation that where are you? And I think these two differences are really show very clearly. And I would say that because of that, it may be two separate psalms.
All right, we have a vote for two separate psalms on the basis of content, on the basis of the emotional content within each. One is highly optimistic and praiseworthy, and one seems frankly brokenhearted and disappointed. Okay, Harold, who's next?
I would say Jeremy, since he wrote me such a thoughtful reflection on this.
Okay, great.
So, at first glance, I thought indeed that there was a disconnect in the two Psalms, but I know we have very little time, so I'm just going to argue this very quickly, that Psalm 9 is, Psalm 9 is the celebration of the presence of God, Psalm 10 begins with the absence of God. It could be argued that really the psalmist begins in Psalm 9 with what the psalmist expects from God, but this surely devolves from absolute belief at in the beginning of the psalm to some kind of prayer. Around verse 14, all of a sudden the surety seems to be fading and continues to fade into just praying to God. And then we arrive at Psalm 10, and it's God is gone, but during the course of the psalm, God emerges triumphant, and the acrostic, which seems to perhaps link the songs, is consistent through Psalm 9 to a large extent, although I think Gimel is missing. But Psalm 10 begins with Lamed, and this is something I didn't think of till late yesterday, which means two. So it's kind of like a symbol to us, and doesn't pick up again until the end with the last 4 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, meaning that in the end, God is triumphant.
Wow.
So Jeremy is thinking about an ongoing narration, and you know, all of us have had this conflicting feeling that we are not quite purely one thing. We are not quite purely celebratory. We are not quite purely down in the depths. That grief is not one pure emotion and joy is not one pure emotion. Why not have a psalm that spans that emotional spectrum. Ben is agreeing with Jeremy in the chat, I believe, because Ben's describing what if there's sort of a landscape to be had here, and there is a change over time, that the psalmist may have started at a point in Psalm 10, informed, Ben suggests, by external factors, maybe a battle. But as time went on, the tone may have changed within the same psalm. Multiple events, but one psalm. Very interesting. Who's
Ellen,
next, Harold?
Poster.
I also came down on the side of it being one.
Okay.
And I was thinking that if you look at it as one and you're looking for like a fulcrum verse, I would suggest verse 16 in Psalm 9, which uses the word reshet, which uses the word net. So right there, you're sort of seeing this change from the praise to looking at the wicked in a different way. And Psalm 9 ends with verse 20, speaking to God directly with Kuma, arise God. And that thought, speaking directly to God, continues right at the beginning of Psalm 10. Why do you stand far off, O Lord? So without the superscription in 10, it seems to me that cry to God continues right from the end of 9, right into 10. And I thought that there was such interesting continued use of the same terms in 9 and 10, like litot b'tzara, times of trouble, and kuma and anavim. So that's why I thought they were continuation.
A number of leitmotifs that may move through the body of one complete psalm, reflected in both these parts. And what I love most about Ellen's suggestion is, Ellen, you were pointing at verse 16 in Psalm 9 as really the fulcrum, somebody described it. And what I love about that is we aren't really sure if we are asking the question, is this one psalm that was broken into two? Why do we make the assumption that verse 1 of Psalm 10 has to start where it does? All of you have studied these texts closely enough that you should have the courage of your convictions. You can say, I don't know if that's really necessarily the right breaking point. Call into question the entire structure, because what if it was broken in the wrong place? Very, very interesting.
Wow. Lisa Brown.
All right, so I have a third scenario.
All right.
So, one of the things that when we were looking at all these musical terms and psalms, and nobody really knows what they mean, that I presented by Joachim Braun, he says that by the time that the Bible is written, redacted, edited, whatever is the appropriate term, that these terms were already lost to antiquity, to their own antiquity. So by the time they show up in the book of Psalms, they're already ancient and lost. So I would wonder, in terms of how these psalms are combined, and there's all these different theories. Richard Friedman has a theory of like the sort of the interlinear way that other texts in the Bible are put together, like how these things are put together, that it's possible that even before the text was written, that these were different texts. And that by the time that the Bible was actually put together as it is, that they were combined, but lost to antiquity is a time when they weren't. Because that's what they look like to me. They just look like they come from different traditions.
Wonderful. So a vote for two separate psalms, 2 votes for one continuous psalm, and a vote for a bunch of different text all put together that we're now receiving as psalms. And I do want to point out in the chat, a vote for all these things being true at once, a very postmodern concept that I like a lot. Who's next?
Rabbi, we're at 10:44. We have 2 last hands up, which perhaps we can fit in and then sing us out. What do you think?
I would really like that. I, of course, respect anybody's time who's got to go at 10:45. We understand this is not the only thing happening in your day, but if those who are able would indulge us for staying a couple minutes extra to hear these ideas and then to hear Cantor Nimi's gorgeous setting one last time, I would appreciate it.
Nina Lubin is our next guest.
Thanks, Harold. One difference I see in the content that I'm not sure if it's leads me to believe 2 separate psalms or something very related, two Psalms that are related. Psalm 9, the psalmist does go into the personal. He asks for God's justice for himself, heal his affliction, have mercy on me. Line 14 is what that's all about. There's nothing in Psalm 10 of the personal. It's more, it seems to me there's a kind of crescendo from the end of Psalm 9 where the lines, the wretched will not forever be wretched, something to that effect, where all of a sudden the focus is on a category of people, on the oppressed, and then Psalm 10 is almost a crescendo. It moves into that spirit and to that plea more than once, many more times than once, with no look at, and oh Lord, my affliction, and save me from the wicked people hassling me. So I don't know if it means two different. If it was one psalm, I'm surprised at why the echo of heal me, oh Lord, heal my affliction doesn't show up again.
We've got a switch of perspective that you find suspicious, shall we say.
Intriguing.
Intriguing, much better word. Thank you, Nina.
I'm going to bet it's Sherry out of Simon and Sherry who has a comment.
Yeah, how'd you guess? So very, very quickly, for me, there's no superscription, and there isn't a 9 and there isn't 11, and we usually see a superscription. So for me, I just thought that sort of lent itself to the idea that it's one psalm. It is a roller coaster, and I did see some continuation, as was mentioned before, of the imagery. So I vote for one psalm.
Lovely. And you're giving us so many more literary devices that can help us to make our decision. How about the superscriptions? How about repeated imageries, refrains, perhaps? All of this was to demonstrate how much you know. This is a group of experts. I mean, think about this. Yes, it's been 20 weeks, but can you believe the fact that we're having this kind of level of conversation? Listen, when Psalms class started, it was already at a very high level, but this debate has been completely populated by the voices of your classmates. This is an absolute testament to the depth of your study, your dedication, your commitment, and your true expertise in this field. I am so impressed. I am so proud of everyone's skill. And it seems perfect to me that you're engaging on 2 weeks of self-directed study, because really this is a group of experts who are convening to consider a very well-loved, very well-known topic to them that they're going to discover new chapters of and new beginnings. So as you engage on your group study, keep these questions in mind. As Harold mentioned, you're going to come across another questionable breakdown point of a psalm that was written that is rendered as 2 but could possibly be 1. And have courage and faith in yourselves and your expertise. You are all extraordinary teachers. So I will wish you a chazak ve'ematz, strength and courage for the next chapter upon which you embark. And I just want to say thank you, because it has been such an absolute pleasure to be a part of this class, to engage with this study and to learn from all of you. So thank you for letting me in for 2 weeks.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. And now we will have Kantronimi sing us.
Thank you.
And I will say an early Shabbat Shalom to everybody, since we will not be singing tomorrow. All right, Kuma, here we go.
Sure. I also just love how we had a very spirited and in very good Talmudic tradition, we had a wonderful and detailed conversation and debate without reaching a conclusion.
Without reaching one conclusion, we reached at least 4, which is very popular.
Again, it's just a very Jewish conclusion to the debate, is to have 4 conclusions.
Yes. Yes.
So, Kuma Adonai. Kuma Adonai al yaoz enosh yishaftu goyim al panecha. Ma Adonai elisa yadecha al tishkach hanavim. Ma kuma Adonai Hoshieni Elohai Hoshieni Elohai Elohai Kuma Adonai. Rise, Adonai, let not mortals be strong, let the nations be judged before you. Rise, Adonai, lift up your hand and don't forget the lowly. Rise, 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 Adonai. Save me, my God. Won't you save me? Won't you save me, Elohai? Elohai, Kuma Adonai. Kuma Adonai. Kuma Adonai.
All right, everyone, until Monday. And thank you again, Rabbi Rapport.
I can't wait till the next time I get to study with you. Early Shabbat Shalom and Mazel Tov to Sherry and Simon.